During the last hearing, one of the victim's relatives simply ran out of the courtroom because she couldn't listen to it anymore. When the defendant talks about his innocence and claims that the prosecution is manipulating the facts.
Watch special episodes as well as regular episodes without ads on Hero/Criminal Patrol.
Hi, Criminal Patrol. Of course, it's impossible not to notice what's happening right now at the district court in Piotrków Trybunalski. Of course, the case concerning Sebastian M, who is suspected of causing the accident. It seemed that the case was obvious after he was detained, after he was brought to Poland. It seems there is guilt, there should be punishment, and it should be a punishment adequate to what he did. However, what is happening right now in court is that the accused has gone on a kind of counter-offensive. I think it disrupts everything, our sense of justice, the feeling that he really won't escape punishment. The trial is of course ongoing, but we want to draw attention to the problem here, a few things that are happening during this trial. We made an episode about this for the channel, of course you can watch it. It was recorded right after the tragedy. For those who haven't seen it or aren't familiar with it, although I think there are very few such people. It all happened on September 16th, 2023. A three-person family. The husband, Patrick, 39 years old, Martina, 37 years old, his wife, and little Oliver, just 5 years old. This family was coming back from a short trip to the seaside, driving to their hometown of Myszków on the A1 route somewhere near Piotrków Trybunalski. Patrick was already not far from home, about 120 kilometers an hour's drive. They had already traveled more than halfway. He was driving normally, calmly, like thousands of other drivers. He just wanted to get home. And then suddenly in the left lane of that road, in the left lane, a car appeared, driving at a tremendous speed. It was a BMW. That BMW was driving in such a way that it literally forced all the other cars off the road, off that left lane. The drivers were getting out of the way, some faster, some slower. You could clearly see that the speed of that car was enormous. At some point that BMW got close to the Kia, the one that was being driven by that three-person family. When they were already in the middle lane, the BMW hit their car. The force of the impact was enormous. The Kia bounced off, hit the crash barriers, and simply burst into flames. The fire was huge. People even stopped, and when the drivers saw that the car was burning, they just got out. They tried to save the family, but the door couldn't be opened. It was jammed. It's possible that because of the heat that was generated, the fire was huge. They couldn't even get close. A terrible death for those three people, because it looks like they simply burned alive in that car. The one who was driving that BMW stopped about 200 meters further down the road. We know today that he took out his phone, but not to call the police, fire department or ambulance, but he made one phone call. The police simply came to his father's place, and all those routine procedures began at the scene, securing evidence. It was clear that this three-person family died in such tragic, almost unbelievable circumstances. The police didn't decide to detain the BMW driver. He was simply allowed to leave. When the police and the prosecutor realized that he might be the perpetrator of the accident, it was already too late. Sebastian M. He simply left for the United Arab Emirates, and that's where he started staying. All of this lasted for quite some time, and then charges were brought against him. Everything was done in absentia because he simply wasn't there. He was in the Emirates the whole time. Then a warrant was issued for him and he was detained there. Finally, his extradition to Poland took almost 2 years. He did not agree to this extradition. He said he didn't want to go to Poland. He doesn't want to answer for what he did here or even participate in the trial at all. Because of this, it took a long time, and the prosecutor's office did everything it could to bring him to the country. They finally succeeded. On May 26th of last year, that is the 25th, he was brought to Poland, and in September of last year, the trial began at the district court in Piotrków Trybunalski. This trial is of course ongoing, and there will be many more hearings. These are just further stages of everything that's happening there. Yes, Sebastian M is 35 years old and comes from a wealthy, very rich family. He wasn't driving that car alone. 2 of his buddies were with him. I think the fact that one of those friends is a lawyer in Łódź also matters in this case. We also know that at least one of those friends wasn't sober. He himself admits that he drank alcohol and wasn't sober at the time of the accident. At this moment, the prosecutor's office has presented this indictment, which is about causing an accident with a fatal outcome. This is a charge that carries a penalty from 6 months to 8 years, and that's my first comment. I thought, to be honest with you, I was hoping that the charge would be completely different. Here, the prosecutor's office could have really stood at such a historic moment, and this charge could have been a charge of murder. Because murder can be committed, I would say, in 2 such versions, with direct intent, meaning someone simply shoots and kills, but there can also be a conditional charge, meaning someone kills but doesn't intend to kill. However, with their behavior, with everything they do, they must be aware that they might kill someone. And that's exactly the case here. Moreover, if we look at the textbooks, which are textbooks, the matter from the penal code, from the code of criminal procedure, we will see that there are certain case studies there that talk about murder in such a hypothetical situation. And one of the examples is driving at an extreme speed in a public place, and such a driver can commit a crime, murder with possible intent. The textbooks mention this, so the prosecutor's office could have faced such a historic moment and probably for the first time in Poland brought such a charge against a driver. Well, I don't know why this wasn't done. In my opinion, this caused the case being heard in the courtroom today to be, I would say, on a completely different level. If such a charge existed, namely a charge of murder, then the defendant's behavior, I suppose, would have been completely different. And he would be fighting not for a few years behind bars, but for his entire life. Because in such a case, there is also the penalty of life imprisonment. We would have a completely different situation. And in my opinion, the prosecution simply didn't take advantage of that. And it could have been done because, in my opinion, there hasn't been a better textbook example for presenting such a charge until now. I'll say it again. Such a charge could have been for murder with intent. He doesn't want to kill, but what he's doing could cause people's deaths. He has to be aware of that, and he's taking that risk. Well, here are all the elements needed to present such a charge. I also think that the prosecution wasn't risking anything, because even if they brought such a charge, meaning here a charge of murder, if they realized in court that something was going wrong, that the defense was managing to undermine this charge, then they could always go back to the charge that is currently in place. Well, they also didn't manage to present, I would say, an intermediate charge between murder and causing an accident. I'm thinking here about causing an accident, but at the same time fleeing the scene or driving under the influence of alcohol. Well, then the penalty would be up to 20 years. I understand the arguments for why such a charge wasn't brought, but it would look different. 20 years versus 8. That's a fundamental difference. Another thing that comes to mind is that the proceedings against the police officers involved in this operation were discontinued too early. There on the spot, as you remember, there were accusations at the time, of course informal accusations, that the police let him leave, that they simply let him escape. That was not confirmed. The investigation that was conducted ruled out any involvement of the police officers here, any conscious involvement at least. In this investigation, it was determined that everything was in order, that the police officers acted as they should. They had that knowledge at the time and they made decisions accordingly. But I think that if something else came up somewhere, if any of them wanted to say something more. Now, since the case has been discontinued, we probably won't learn anything new. I think that the case was simply discontinued too early. They should have waited until the main thread concerning the accident was finished, and maybe only then discontinued the case. The issue of those two friends who were in the car also remained unresolved. As if nothing happened, there was no investigation here, and this matter was basically not addressed at all. And that's another thing in this case that is visible in the courtroom. At some point, the defendant also said that he feels sorry for the family, that he wants to take part in mediation, but nothing came of it. A statement that he admits guilt. He feels sorry, but he does not admit guilt. And it seems to me that this was also a kind of tactic. Well, potentially in the future, if someone undertakes such mediation, is the initiator, then it may influence, for example, an extraordinary reduction of the sentence. It could have been a kind of strategic move, simply a ploy. Also, at the time when these mediations were taking place, the defendant's lawyer filed a motion to have his detention lifted for health reasons. Well, presumably it was thought that we should take into account that the mediations are ongoing, that maybe these mediations are on the right track, and in fact he will actually be able to stand trial while not in custody. Well, there are plenty of things like that which are constantly being used by the defense attorneys. Nothing really came out of those mediations. As the attorney representing the victims said, they stated that during those mediations they lost trust in the accused. So it seems that they realized he just wanted to take advantage of them. Even that last hearing, I would say, was just as I mentioned at the beginning. A real counteroffensive by the accused and his attorneys or female attorneys, even undermining everything that the prosecution had built. As they say, all these accusations are a kind of hypothesis that is not true, a hypothesis contradicted by the witnesses themselves. Therefore, the defendant's lawyers are calling in, one by one, everyone who was at the scene, including police officers, firefighters, even road workers, and questioning them. You can see from this that the core of all this is a certain line of defense that is meant to indicate something. A private expert opinion is also supposed to appear there because the existing expert opinions are also being challenged. A private expert opinion that would suggest it was an accident and not caused by the impact of that BMW car. What does all this come down to? Well, at the scene of the accident, a spare wheel was found, the so-called temporary spare, which is used when the main wheel gets damaged. And the statement is that Patrick was driving on that spare wheel, and because he was driving too fast and for too long, the car caught fire, and that it was an unfortunate accident. But as if it was the fault of the family who was driving, therefore the accused has nothing to do with it. And now why are other police officers who were at the scene being called in? Well, the point is that the police officers secured the evidence poorly, that they secured it too late, that the evidence does not reflect the actual state of things, that the traces from the spare tire were not secured, and those traces are obviously different from the traces of the main regular tire. Therefore, the hypothesis that he was driving on a spare tire is possible. As you know, in legal proceedings, any arguments or evidence that cannot be explained are interpreted in favor of the defendant. This is a line of defense that the car caught fire because P, transliterated as Patrick, was driving on the spare tire, and the spare tire caused the car to catch fire. Yes, that's more or less how this line of defense goes. Therefore, the defendant says that he is innocent and that these are manipulations by the prosecutor's office. That this accusation is a kind of hypothesis which is untrue, and the facts that they know best prove it. Well, the defense also raises the issue of the speed at which this car was driving, this BMW. The experts calculated that it was driving at a speed of 315 kilometers per hour. Well, anyone who drives a car realizes that this is an absolutely dizzying speed, that it's a speed at which you can't control the car, that any mistake or even something like an uneven surface can cause an accident to happen. I think that very few drivers have ever driven at a speed of 200, for example, 250 kilometers per hour, and here it's 315 kilometers per hour. Therefore, the defense wanted to approach the company. Is that even possible? However, it seems to me that at this point they forget that this BMW was no longer a real BMW from the factory. So like a serial factory production. But after all, this car was tuned in a special service, it was modified, and all the speed limits were removed there, just like in a factory car. So turning to the company, to BMW, to ask if such driving is possible, well, that's also a kind of maneuver, but I would say it's purely technical, meant to give the impression that this car couldn't have driven at such a speed. Well, it could, because it was modified. Well, the defense here, the defendant also accuses the prosecutor's office of certain manipulations, especially at the moment when he was brought to Poland, when the prosecutor's office was seeking his extradition. There is even a statement that Poland falsified the documentation. So you see that literally everything is being questioned. The credibility of the prosecutor's office, the credibility of the collected documents, the credibility of the expert opinions, the hypotheses, everything that can be imagined in all of this and that can somehow be challenged. Also in the courtroom, well, that's what the journalists who are there all the time are saying. There are huge emotions on the spot. During the last hearing, one of the victim's relatives simply ran out of the courtroom because she couldn't listen anymore to the accused talking about his innocence and claiming that the prosecutor's office is manipulating the facts. She just couldn't take it anymore and couldn't listen to it. It also seems that the accused has support from his family. Journalists also say that they are there, supporting him in some way with their looks, and they also ask the judge if they can at least record his statements. Well, that also creates a certain emotional atmosphere. The victims' families are certainly going through all of this, but there's no other way. That's the law, he can do that, and they're trying to oppose it in some way. I also think that the fact that they go to the cemetery to visit their loved ones who died matters too. Every time there's supposed to be a trial, it's also something that is meant to emotionally strengthen them. And definitely also the judge who presides over the panel of judges. It's not easy to keep control over all of this. It seems that even maintaining discipline in the courtroom is difficult, as there are occasional voices and nervous laughter. But it's also hard to control. I think it's hard to control. Above all, it's difficult for those who are victims, because these are, I would say, extraordinary situations. For example, when the accused here accused the prosecution of falsifying documents. The judge asks, "Why didn't you just stay in the country? Why didn't you just take it all on the chin, as they say?" To which the accused, in his explanation, said that he had business obligations in the United Arab Emirates. When asked why he stayed in the Emirates until his extradition and didn't come back earlier, the accused says that he was afraid of the hate he would face in Poland. So here, he has an answer for every argument, but these answers also cause a nervous laugh, and that nervous laugh just appears in the courtroom. Of course, we are in the middle of everything that's happening, in the middle of these hearings, and there will definitely be many more. Well, we're all waiting for a fair verdict. However, in this case, a family died, a normal family who just wanted to go home. So, in that case, will any verdict that is passed be fair? Of course, that's a rhetorical question. That's all for today. Of course, we will be following what is happening in Piotrków Trybunalski. And of course, as always, subscribe to our channel, and as usual, take care.
Watch special episodes as well as regular episodes without ads on herohero.co/Kryminalny Patrol.